So there will be a bit of a delay to the YouTube session.
Okay.
I'm turning off chat there, so we'll only be chat here in the Zoom session.
Okay.
And that's me talking on the YouTube channel. So that is now live. And then, let me see. I'm going to mute myself while I figure this out.
Okay.
So I'm really bad with like silence during Zoom sessions. Michael, how are you doing today?
Good. How are you?
I'm pretty good. Working from home, but
Yes, me too.
when you like proposed this topic, you mentioned that you've given similar presentations at the Alamo before.
I was are you familiar with the Sexism Cinema series that is run out of the Women and Gender Studies program here?
No, I'm actually completely new to tech.
Oh, okay. So at the Alamo Drafthouse Theater here has a movie club series, and one of the themes of that is run by Women and Gender Studies here, and it's called Sexism Cinema. And a couple of years ago, they were showing Aliens, the second Alien movie, and I saw it advertised, and I said, can I be on the panel too? Because I'm a big fan of the Alien series. I'll talk about Alien Resurrection in my talk today. But basically, we talked about, aliens as, is it feminist or not? It's written by a man. It has a lot of male stereotypes and has these very strong, like, women are mothers and saviors type thing. So, a lot of themes like that. And certainly what I'm doing in my talk today, I do a lot in my undergrad courses, specifically my cognitive psychology course. I talk about, someone posted, are there mute, unmute options available to attendees? You guys have to figure that out.
So for, let's see here. Attendees, I believe you can only hear and see what's going on. We do not have video or audio for you enabled.
Okay. So if they have questions, they'll have to type them.
Type them into the chat box, yes.
Okay.
And would it be helpful if we made like an arrangement where, Michael, do you want to take questions as you go? One of us could like verbally interrupt in case you don't have to monitor the chat.
I can certainly, if there's a pressing question, you can certainly interrupt me and direct me to answer the question then. So whatever, I'm flexible.
Okay.
Okay.
But what I was saying was I do this in my courses too. I teach cognitive psychology, and we talk about how memory and other aspects of cognition are correctly or incorrectly presented in movies. When I teach general psychology or intro psychology, I do the same thing, including other topics, mental illness, things like that. I love to show movie clips in my courses as part of, the lesson.
Okay, so it's noon. Looks like we've got 15 attendees. There's 4 of us. I think Rob's one of our attendees as well. So thank you for everybody being here today. We'll go ahead and get started. So my name's Erin Burns. I am a new STEM librarian here to Tech. I started here in July 2020. This is our first session in the Science Meets Popular Culture series. This is coming to you from the University Libraries at Texas Tech, and we are very grateful today to have Michael Cera talking to us about memory in the movies. And so if Michael's okay with this, I'm going to go ahead and just read the bio that you sent me.
Sure.
Okay, so Michael Cera is an associate professor here of cognition and cognitive neuroscience in the Department of Psychological Sciences at Texas Tech University. Prior to arriving at Texas Tech, he was a postdoctoral researcher at Columbia University. He has received his PhD from Kent State University in 2007. Dr. Cera conducts research on memory, metacognition, and student learning. He currently serves on the editorial board of the journal Metacognition and Learning. Dr. Cera is a media nerd who loves film, television, comic books, and video games. So thank you, Dr. Cera, for joining us today. I too went to Kent State University.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for having me. And certainly it's an honor, especially to be the first talk in the series. And I'm certainly looking forward to the other ones in the future. I'm going to go ahead and turn off my video and share my screen. So just make sure that's working right. Can you see my PowerPoint okay? Or is it still loading?
Yes, it looks okay. We see your full screen for the PowerPoint. There you go.
There we go. Is that good?
Good.
Yes.
Okay, I guess I can't turn off my video. Can you still hear me okay?
Indeed.
Okay, great. So I'll start. So thank you again for having me. So I'm going to be talking about memory as depicted in popular movies. So basically, I will briefly talk about episodic memory, which is the type of memory I'll be focusing on. I will talk briefly about how many forms of memory function in film and movies. I will spend the majority of my talk talking about aspects of memory and memory functioning as depicted in popular films. Sometimes that's correctly done, sometimes it's incorrect, sometimes it's fantastical or science fiction, which is, often a blend of both. And then I think we'll have more than enough time for discussion and Q&A. So if you're not familiar, there are multiple ways to chop up the human memory system. There are multiple systems and subsystems and types of memory. I will mostly be talking about episodic memory today. A few places we'll talk about some others. Episodic memories are our long-term memories about our lived past experiences, episodes, and events. So you might know about past facts, but if you didn't experience it, that's a factual memory. It's not an episodic memory. So another way to cut up our memory system, we often are familiar with a short-term versus long-term distinction in memory. Your long-term memory is basically permanent. You might forget things, but it's basically permanent and there forever. Within the long-term memory system, you have an implicit memory system. This is things you know, but you often can't verbalize. So this is your skills, your conditioning or associations, or even your priming, which affects how you react to stimuli. The branch we'll be talking about is explicit long-term memory. This is declarative. These are things you can talk about. This includes our long-term semantic memory or memory for facts, as well as the one we'll be focusing on, which is our long-term memory for episodes or events. Now, a lot of times in movies, we see flashbacks. So this is where the writer or the director chooses to show you something from the character's past. Usually it's done to create a contrast, either because it's similar or different to a current event in the movie. Now, from the viewer's perspective, there's little difference between seeing a flashback or seeing a depicted character's memory. They show up on the screen, and many times we can't tell the difference. Sometimes things are done to make it clear to us whether it's a memory or a flashback scene, but often it's the same. One major difference, though, is often the writer or the director chooses to show us a memory rather than a flashback scene, to show us that that past event is so important to the character that it's still affecting them in some way in the present. So for example, the opening of Apocalypse Now, we see Willard, clearly experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder. He's still in Vietnam, but yet his recent memories of the Vietnam War are still haunting him are haunting him in the present. And Coppola shows us this by literally overlaying these. He could have just shown this in flashback, but he literally overlays these flashback scenes onto shots of Willard, being basically depressed, abusing drugs and alcohol in his hotel room, to show us that these are still affecting him now. Rogue One, which was the first Star Wars movie to break from the episode numbering system, also broke with a lot of things from the first 7 Star Wars movies, namely that in the first 7 Star Wars movies, you never see a flashback. You never really see a flash forward. Rogue One breaks this rule twice. So it opens with a true flashback scene. We see Jyn when she's a young girl. And then at the end of that scene, it goes right into the opening title. Later in the movie, we see some of the same footage again, interspersed with some other footage of her as a young girl living on the planet Coruscant. Yet then she wakes up, and she wakes up because she was dreaming. So these memories were showing up in her dreams because they're relevant for her again. So we have to be shown that she's thinking about her past. She's thinking about her past relationship with her father specifically, and that it's still affecting her now. One thing I realized as I was putting together this talk is usually when the writer or the director chooses to show memory as opposed to flashback, it's often very negative. It's often trauma, as opposed to just simply showing, a past scene. The original RoboCop has one of the most, I think, brutal murder scenes ever, when the bad guys kill Officer Murphy before he becomes RoboCop. Later in the movie, even though he's now a cyborg, he's not supposed to have any connection to his past humanity, this memory of being murdered is literally haunting him, even though he's basically in his charging station in this, like a phone in this scene. He has a nightmare about being killed. And of course, he gets up out of this chair, storms off to go catch these guys. He ends up killing them, but to go catch them. So clearly, again, they're trying to show that obviously this murder was so important that it's still motivating him now. So again, memories often have a function within a movie, within a story, but sometimes memory or memory functioning is central to the plot. And that's really what I'll be talking about today. And sometimes, as I said before, it may or may not be correct. So that's what we're talking about. So for the rest of this time, I will talk about how memory is used in movies, especially when they're central to the plot. Some caveats: I could not have enough time to talk about or find every single movie that's, quote, about memory. I probably forgot your favorite movie, especially if your favorite movie is Inception. I'm not talking about Inception, sorry. We could talk about it in the Q&A if you want. My students always want to talk about Inception, and I don't. I will try not to spoil any movies if you haven't seen them. I might accidentally, I'm sorry. So one of the best examples of using memory in various ways is the Disney Pixar movie Inside Out. If you're not familiar with it, it's about a young girl named Riley, and she's basically like a preteen. Within her head, she has these 5 emotions: joy, anger, sadness, disgust, anxiety, and they basically run her. They control her. Some of them are more dominant than others. Because she's young, joy tends to be the most dominant one. The premise of this movie, if you're my age, you might remember the TV show Herman's Head from the early 90s. Basically the same exact premise. Now, certainly the plot of Inside Out is very tied to memory and memory functioning. So these little colored balls you see in the background here are Riley's long-term memories. They're color-coded based on which emotion dominated that memory at the time. They get a lot of things right. Now, certainly it wasn't the point of this movie to depict memory realistically. It's certainly a fantastical movie, but they clearly did their homework. Most of the things they cover are quite accurate in one way or another. So for example, one thing they totally get right is that when we make new memories, the process that converts them into long-term memory, which we usually call memory consolidation, mostly occurs during REM, so during our dreams. So we see this in the movie, that the little people that live in her head actually film her dreams like they're filming a movie or a TV show. Actually, what they're doing, and they depict this as well, is they're converting these memories into the long-term memories. So that, despite the fantastical presentation of it, is actually pretty accurate how they did it. Another thing they totally got, right, and clearly did on purpose, is that as memories get converted to long-term, in theory, permanent memories, they're going to move mostly from hypothalamus out to neocortex, out to the outer cortex of the brain, where these wrinkles are, so the gyri. And they depict this. You can see it in this scene up here. You can see it in the background on my earlier slides. The memories are stored in these big wavy storage units. They're clearly meant to mimic the outer cortex of the brain. Now, some things that they obviously didn't get exactly right here. Our memories, even though they're stored out in the neocortex, they are probably not stored in a single unit or a single engram. They are certainly not stored as a single ball of light. But they get, they clearly based this fictional, fantastical world on a lot of very accurate, very realistic stuff. Another thing they did well, we certainly can activate or retrieve our long-term memories in a number of different ways. Sometimes we do this purposefully. So for example, there are a few scenes where Riley is basically getting depressed. They can send or activate a joyous, which is why it's yellow, long-term memory. So in this case, they're basically watching a memory of her going on this road trip with her family to make her happy when she's feeling down. Another thing they do is accidental activation. So there's these two characters up here that you see, and sometimes as a joke, they send up to central processing, they activate this memory of the triple dent gum jingle. And of course, it annoys Riley. This happens to us all the time as well. We don't always purposefully activate memories. Sometimes memories are accidentally activated by the environment, and we don't always know why. So there's a good running joke about it, in the movie. Something they don't do 100% accurately, because they're using memories as videos in this way, it kind of works towards this incorrect idea that our memories work like videos, where once we record or make a memory, we can play it back and it basically plays back the same way. This is certainly not 100% accurate. Every time we activate an old memory, it basically has to get recreated. Now, because of this, and this will become important in some of the movies I'll talk about later, every time you reactivate a memory, you can change it, whether you meant to or not. You can distort it. Now, you might choose to do this, and there are good reasons to do it, but sometimes this happens accidentally and causes problems. That said, they're very cognizant of the fact that our memories do change over time. So one of the major plot lines of the movie is that when Riley was younger, most of her memories were joyous. As she's becoming a young teenager, her sadness emotion is starting to dominate not only her general thinking, but her memories. In this scene, what you see here is sadness is accidentally recoloring a past memory that used to be a happy memory into kind of a sad memory. And this is certainly true. As we grow up, old memories, we look back, they take on a different spin. You might have a memory from junior high or high school that at the time was super embarrassing, and now as an adult is kind of humorous, for example. So they certainly got that right. One thing, that's more than a little silly. We do not have anything called core memories. So one premise in this movie is that our personalities are kind of defined by 5 really important memories in our lives, and those can change over time. There's probably nothing like that in our real personalities, memory and personality. Not that past events can't affect who you are or how you act, they certainly can, but memories are not usually considered core to personality. If you've seen Pixar's most recent film, Soul, they actually did a better job of, or a more representative job of depicting what determines personality than Inside Out did. Another thing they don't quite get right, old memories don't actually fade away. So sometimes we talk about memories as decaying. They don't actually do that. What happens to long-term memories is more like these little black balls you see here. Long-term memories, sometimes we can no longer retrieve. We can't get at them. So the reason we forget from long-term memory is usually not that the memory is no longer there. It's just that we cannot access it. Now, of course, sorry, this is a spoiler. If you ever want to make your students cry, you can talk about this scene where Riley's former childhood imaginary friend Bing Bong sacrifices himself and basically dies. I mean, he fades away. Anytime I bring this up in class, my students get very upset. So I'm sorry if I'm triggering you guys right now. But don't worry, memories can't actually fade away. In fact, Bing Bong should actually be in there forever. And it's just possible that Riley may or may not ever think about him again. It's not exactly the same. Now, a lot of movies and TV shows certainly deal with forms of amnesia or forms of forgetting. One major type of amnesia is retrograde amnesia. This is where you lose past information. Oftentimes there's some type of accident, a head trauma, something that happens. You're losing information before that event. Presumably it's not going to affect your ability to make new memories, but we'll talk about that in a couple of slides. Of course, one good example of that is the Bourne Identity. Matt Damon's character, Jason Bourne, he's an assassin or a special agent of some kind. He's on a mission, it kind of fails, he gets shot, he gets hit in the head, he falls in the water, and he wakes up and he can't remember who he is. He still has all his skills, he has his fighting skills, he can speak all these languages, etc., but he can't remember who he is. Wolverine in the X-Men comic books and movies, he has a similar problem. He can't remember who he is or his past, even though he's over 100 years old. He can't remember any of it, but he certainly has all his skills, his language, etc. There are comedies about this. So the 1980s comedy Overboard, where Goldie Hawn's character, she's rich, she's mean, she falls in the water or falls off her yacht, gets hit in the head. Her handyman takes her in and tricks her into thinking that she's his wife. We won't get into the ethics of that. Now, certainly head injuries can cause some memory loss. Usually what happens is people can't remember the car accident or they can't remember their injury. That might not be because necessarily of amnesia per se as memory loss. In many cases, it's because the memory was never made to begin with for various reasons. But head injuries can cause some loss of episodic memory. It might be temporary, it might be permanent, it kind of depends on the injury. One thing that's usually overdone in these movies is memory loss and injuries are usually very clean, meaning they have very specific and limited effects. So in Overboard, in The Vow, the character forgets who they are or who they were. Nothing else is affected. They don't have any motor impairments. They don't have any language impairments. That would ruin the movie, of course. So all that has changed is who they are, maybe their personality. In both Overboard and The Vow, of course, the character who experiences the memory loss was not such a great person and kind of becomes a better person when they are not themselves. Certainly there are downsides to promoting that idea as well. And it's certainly not super realistic. There are much more realistic movies about, for example, forms of actual brain injury. The movie Concussion, which of course is based on real events, does a much more realistic depiction of the things that various forms of brain damage can cause, not only in terms of affecting our memory functioning, but it leads to other disabilities as well. It affects other aspects of our cognition and thinking. It affects our motor abilities. It can affect how you speak. It can give you a tremor. You can have a stroke and not only have memory problems after, but you can obviously have movement problems depending on what area of the brain was damaged. So, with a lot of these amnesias, they're not usually depicted very realistically. Just to make fun of one of the X-Men movies, Origins, Wolverine, came out 2009. They show us how, at least in the cinematic movies, how Wolverine lost his memories. After he already has his adamantium skeleton put on, and if you don't know Wolverine, he has a mutant ability to heal very quickly. He gets shot in the head with an adamantium bullet, We can use Matt Damon's brain here. You'll notice in this picture, it went in through the frontal lobe. And then it heals up real quick, and then he can't remember who he is. Now, there are a lot of accounts of this. If you want to get real nerdy, some accounts that maybe the bullet bounced around inside his metal skull and damaged other parts of the brain, therefore damaging his sense of self and his past memories. That said, he should have lost his skills. He should have lost his ability to talk. He lost none of those. He only lost his sense of self. So again, this super clean, very specific, very limited mental memory loss that only affects memory, doesn't affect anything else. Now, most forms of retrograde amnesia, we call it retrograde because it exhibits a retrograde pattern. What this means is that usually the most recent memories are the ones that are affected more than older ones, or they're affected sooner than older ones. Sooner than older memories is important. When we talk about dementia or Alzheimer's, those are definitely usually exhibit a retrograde pattern. So there are movies that depict this realistically. Still Alice, again, it was also based on a real story, on a real person. She has an early onset Alzheimer's. You clearly see retrograde memory loss. So she loses more recent memories sooner. And eventually by the end of the movie, sorry to spoil it, but this is how actual Alzheimer's functions as well. She starts to experience as well trouble making new memories, which we'll talk about in a second. She starts to experience other cognitive impairments. She starts to lose language, etc. So some movies, you know, more realistic movies usually get this more right. Now, some of these things that we might term amnesia probably wouldn't really qualify as amnesia, even though these people were hit in the head. Something like Overboard, where you forget who you are, but you become suddenly, you're a mean person, you suddenly become a nice, somewhat caring person. It's probably something more like a dissociative or a psychogenic fugue. In the later Jason Bourne movies, it kind of comes out that probably the memory loss, the loss of sense of self, of identity that he's experienced is probably more like a fugue. What this fugue means is you're having trouble dealing with your life as it is. So you go into this associative state where you're no longer that person. You think you're someone else. Usually those people will go back into it. And that's, you know, depicted to different extents in these movies. Certainly by the end of Overboard, Goldie Hawn's character realizes who she actually is, and that this whole other life was kind of made up for her. But then she realizes that she actually fell in love with the guy. She actually liked his kids, who, you know, their mother had passed away, and it has a happy ending. And she's no longer a mean, rich person. It doesn't always work that way, you know, in the real world. For better or worse, some movies use memory problems as a joke or as a punchline, and certainly we're not going to encourage that. So, you know, I don't know really how to categorize Dory's memory problems in Finding Nemo and Finding Dory. Certainly, Aunt Bethany in National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation, she clearly has, you know, some form of dementia. Yeah, her character's funny, her scenes are funny. At the same time, you're making fun of a, you know, a serious condition. So, you know, there's always an ethical question when you get to those scenes. As I hinted earlier, sometimes it's not that characters are forgetting their past events. They can no longer make new memories. And this actually shows up in, despite the fact that it's fairly rare in terms of real world memory loss, it shows up in a number of movies. Probably the two that come to mind whenever I bring this up in my classes, for example. The first one is 50 First Dates. If you've never seen this, Drew Barrymore's character has a car accident before the movie starts that causes her to have anterograde amnesia. Anterograde amnesia means you cannot make new memories. You still remember everything before the accident, who you are, your past, but you can't make a new memory. So basically every day you wake up and it's like starting over. You still think it's the day of that accident. Adam Sandler falls in love with her and basically has to woo her every day. The other really good example is the movie Memento, which was written by Jonathan Nolan, directed by Christopher Nolan. They Jonathan Nolan clearly did his homework on this one. It's very, very accurate in terms of the memory stuff. If you're not familiar with this movie, basically what happens is before the movie starts, the main character, Lenny, the house gets broken into, his wife gets killed, he gets hit in the head, by the burglar, he gets hit in the head, he gets damage to his hypothalamus, he can no longer make new memories, but he's trying to solve his wife's murder. He's trying to find the guy who did this. He gets around this, and he explains this multiple times in the movie. He gets tattoos, for one thing, with the clues that he has uncovered so far to help him remember. And they're all backwards so that he can read them, in the mirror when he wakes up. He also uses a notepad, and he takes a lot of Polaroid pictures to kind of serve as his new memory. And that causes a lot of confusion. But that's how he does it. There's a similar, mechanism by the end of 50 First Dates. Adam Sandler is making Drew Barrymore's character Lucy a video every day to help bring her up to speed. It's a lot of work, but he does it. Now, even though people with anterograde amnesia can't make new episodic memories, their implicit memory is still usually intact, so they can still be conditioned. In other words, they can learn associations, even though they won't be necessarily verbally aware of them. They can still learn to associate things as good or bad, as liking things or disliking things. They can learn skills, they can learn habits. They just won't be verbally aware of it. So much of the what we know about anterograde amnesia comes from a famous patient who died a few years ago. His initials were HM. And certainly you could tell a lot of the background stuff of Memento is based on HM. One of the classic examples of this fact here is that HM could still learn skills. So this task that's depicted here is a mirror tracing task. So all you have to do is trace with a pen or a pencil the shape that's on the piece of paper. You cannot see the piece of paper in front of you. You cannot see your own hand. You have to look in the mirror. So you're basically tracing it backwards. What you see on these little graphs on the bottom here, this is the error rate. So on day one, HM starts out quite bad at it, as most of us would. By the end of day one, he's actually pretty good. His error rate has gotten much lower. He comes back on day two, he's much better from the get-go. By the end of the day, he's almost perfect. He comes back on day three and he's perfect or near perfect. This is actually a pretty typical, if not slightly better than average learning for this task. The weird thing is, though, every day you brought HM into the lab to do this, you had to explain this task to him anew. He didn't remember ever doing it. If you asked him, how are you going to do on this task, he would say, I'm going to be terrible at it. This seems very difficult, even on day three, where he does a great job of it. So he's not aware that he's been trained. He's not aware. He can't remember doing this task before, yet he's getting better and better at it. This kind of thing is brought up throughout Memento. So one of Lenny's tattoos on his hand, which he's trying to wash off here, he doesn't remember he even has this. It's a tattoo. It says, remember Sammy Jenkins. So Sammy Jenkins is another character who's mentioned in the movie. He also seemed to have anterograde amnesia, but it seems that Sammy Jenkins was faking it. Part of the reason it seemed he was faking it, what they would do is they would take him into the lab every day and they would train him on a puzzle, a problem-solving type puzzle. But one of the puzzle pieces was shocked, was rigged to give him an electric shock every time he touched it. The problem was he came in every day, touched this piece, and was surprised to get the shock. What should have happened over time is he should have learned an implicit negative association to that piece. He should have disliked it and refused to touch it, even though he would not be able to tell you why. He should have learned to dislike that piece and not to want to touch it. So they're able to show that Sammy Jenkins might have been faking it. Now, some movies depict superior memory abilities. So memory abilities that are above average. One of the most classic ones, of course, is Rain Man, which starred Dustin Hoffman and Tom Cruise. So his name's Raymond, but his brother used to call him Rain Man. So Raymond, he has a form of autism spectrum disorder, but he has very good memory abilities, and they are certainly far above average. This is depicted, not only can he memorize books and sits there and memorizes books, Tom Cruise's character gives him a phone book to distract him for a bit, and he in one sitting memorizes all the names and phone numbers from A to G in one sitting. That is not something that most of us could do on purpose, even if we tried. And yet he just sits there and does it without even having to put much effort into it. Most famously, his memory abilities are depicted in the scene where they go to the casino and he counts cards. This scene is later both referenced and parodied in the movie The Hangover in 2009, kind of emphasizing the stereotype that people might not be the most smart people, but sometimes they have above average abilities. This used to be called, savant abilities. We certainly do not say idiot savant anymore, although that certainly is what is depicted in Rain Man and in The Hangover. No matter what, though, it certainly is true that some people who are on the autism spectrum do show some enhanced mental abilities compared to people who are not on this spectrum. For example, not only being able to memorize things quite easily, some people on the spectrum can do mental calculation. They can do very complex math in their head. They can calculate dates on the calendar without looking at a calendar. Some of them can draw from memory. When I say draw from memory, I mean near, not photo quality, but certainly near perfect drawings that are, you would think that the person who drew them was looking at a reference. They were not looking at a physical reference. They were thinking of what they saw. Not everyone on the autism spectrum has such abilities, of course. Now, even though Raymond, the character, was based on several real people, mostly on this guy on the left here, Kim Peek, who died a few years ago. Now, despite the fact that he was mostly based on Kim Peek, Peek probably had FG syndrome, not autism. FG syndrome is very rare, more rare than autism. It results in certainly atypical body development as well as atypical brain development. You'll notice in the picture on the bottom left, Kim Peek's head was rather large. He not only had a very large head, he had a very large brain. His brain had almost no corpus callosum. So the corpus callosum is the part of the brain that connects the two hemispheres. So if you think of our brain like a walnut, it has those two big halves. The corpus callosum is a central structure that connects the two and allows crosstalk between the two hemispheres. He basically didn't have that. And I mean this as a compliment. His brain was a lot more like a dolphin's brain. If you're not familiar with a dolphin has a hyper hemispheric brain. They basically have two brains. They can sleep on one side of their brain while the other side is awake, which is why they don't have to sleep in the ocean. He could basically, even though it seems like he experienced one unitary existence, he can certainly do, basically run the two halves of his brain concurrently. He could not only memorize books in one sitting, he could read and memorize 2 pages of the book at the same time. He said he could probably do the card counting that was in Rain Man, but he said he would not do it for ethical reasons. And certainly, he had a profound ability to just memorize information with little or no effort. Another condition, which is also very rare, there's only 100 and something people identified with this currently in the world, is hyperthymesia. This is the ability to remember almost any lived experience you ever had. Now, unlike autism or FG syndrome, this is not really associated with any other cognitive or physical deficiencies. Some people with hyperthymesia seem to have an atypical hypothalamus. It might be slightly larger than normal, but it is not complete. It's not abnormal in terms of its internal structure of functioning. They also have some tendency for obsessive compulsive like behaviors, but not so much that necessarily causes them a problem. I could not find a lot of movies that had hyperthymesia in them. One I found I had never heard of is called The Dark Place. It came out in 2014. Long story short, the main character has hyperthymesia and he's trying to solve a murder. And I guess being able to remember everything could help you do that. Similarly, there was a TV show called Unforgettable that came out in 2011. The main character was a detective, and she also used her hyperthymesia to solve crimes. In the real people who have hyperthymesia, I have never heard of any of them being employed in law enforcement or solving crimes. One of the probably most well-known people who have hyperthymesia is the actress Mary Lou Henner, not her character on Taxi, the actual person. And she, is happy to talk about this in interviews. There are plenty of interviews with her online that you could watch where she talks about this. It might have helped her to memorize scripts, for TV shows, commercials, movies, etc. But other than that, it doesn't really give her any real advantage in the world. People with hyperthymesia, they can think back, they can remember not only anything they experienced that was important, they could remember unimportant things. They can remember, you give them a random day in history and that they lived, and they can tell you what the weather was, where they were. They can tell you what they were wearing that day. The nice thing about Mary Lou Henner is because she's famous, a lot of times you can not only verify where, obviously for anyone, you can verify what the weather was on that day, but if she says she remembers what she wore that day, sometimes there's photos and footage of her on that day, so it's verifiable. But again, other than having this ability to remember almost anything that they've ever lived through or experienced, they don't really show any other deficiencies. Now, sometimes in movies, people have really good memory because of some type of enhancement, perhaps cybernetic, which we'll talk about in a second, or in this case, drugs. So in the movie Lucy, which came out in 2014, in the movie Limitless and the spin-off TV series, a lot of these had drugs that gave the characters enhanced memory performance. Lucy also brings up something that I want to put down, which is the so-called 10% myth. If you're not familiar with the 10% myth, it's basically we only use 10% of our brain. Therefore, if only we could use the rest of our brain, we would have superpowers. Now, if you're familiar with the South Park joke that Morgan Freeman earns a new freckle every time he explains something in a movie, I definitely think he should lose a freckle for this one. I hope you're all laughing. I wish I could see people, and maybe you're laughing, maybe you're not, but that's fine. In fact, most of us, unless you have a brain damage of some kind, most of us use all of our brains. And furthermore, certainly the powers that Lucy eventually demonstrates in the movie when she gets up to close to 100% or uses 100% of her brain, where she can warp space and time with her mind, those are certainly impossible. No drugs are going to give you that ability. Limitless is a little bit more realistic because certainly there are plenty of drugs that can boost your cognitive abilities, at least temporarily. Caffeine is one of them. Certainly amphetamines boost your alertness, boost your wakeness, your vigilance, your ability to maintain attention. But it's in the short term, it's not superhuman. The military, gives pilots on long-term missions amphetamines to stay awake and stay alert. They are not warping space and time with their mind afterwards. So certainly a lot of this part is greatly exaggerated. Now, that said, so-called ordinary people, when I say ordinary, I mean you don't have any of the conditions we talked about. I don't mean to use ordinary in a derogatory way. Anyone really can use mnemonics to memorize large amounts of information. So a mnemonic is some type of system that helps you recall complex information in the future. So for example, some people can memorize tens of thousands of digits of pi, which is an infinitely non-repeating number. They could memorize the order of cards in one or more decks of cards. Again, they are not using special drugs. They don't have special brains. They are doing this using techniques. So most techniques involve something known as the Method of Loci. You might know it as a memory palace. They might use bizarre interactive imagery. Many of them report using both. So memory palace or Method of Loci is often talked about in the TV series Sherlock, the Benedict Cumberbatch version, where he remembers a lot of information by doing Method of Loci, where basically you're associating the pieces of information with locations in a physical imagined space, an imagined physical space. And you basically imagine yourself walking through the space, and that triggers the pieces of information. Now, this works even better if you get the pieces of information to interact with each other, especially in a bizarre way. So in a typical cognitive psychology laboratory memory experiment, you might have to remember pairs of things. You might have to form associations between two otherwise unrelated things, such as a piano and a cigar. So the examples here, the most memorable one is going to be the one that is both interactive and bizarre. So in that final square there, the piano is smoking the cigar. That should be the most memorable of any of the examples here. I certainly have to bring up the movie Johnny Mnemonic, which is a cyberpunk movie that came out in 1995, in part, not only because it's about technically, well, mnemonic is in the title, even though it's not really about mnemonics. It takes place in the future, 2021, where everyone has cybernetic implants and lives in a virtual reality world or works in a virtual reality world online, which I guess is kind of accurate this year. Importantly, Johnny Mnemonic is basically an information courier, so he gets paid to curry information. He has an implant in his brain that allows him to store a whopping 80 gigs of information. If he takes some pills, he can expand this to 160 gigs. The plot of the movie is he gets paid to transport some scientific information that's about 300 gigs. And that's going to overload his implant. If he can't get the information delivered and extracted in a certain amount of time, he's going to start to lose his own memories and I guess die. In the meantime, the Yakuza's after him. It's very complicated. In actual 2021, we would try to email the information, I guess, put it on a server, a Google Drive, solve the problem real quick. Genetic memory. So, sorry, I'm just looking at my clock. I'm going to have to speed up, I think. So if you've never seen Alien Resurrection, hopefully you saw Alien 3. You might remember at the end of Alien 3, Sigourney Weaver's character Ripley dies, yet they're able to clone her in this movie. How does that? Now, interestingly, she can remember, she has Ripley's memories. So how did this happen? Well, it turns out that she's basically part, I'm sorry, I'm speeding through this to make sure we don't run out of time. She's basically part alien. The aliens have genetic memory. This is certainly a good deal exaggerated. There is something called epigenetics. This means that you can inherit some changes in gene expression or phenotype without actually changing underlying DNA or genotypes. So for example, these roundworms here on the left, you can get them to change the temperature at which they fluoresce or give off color under UV light. Once you do this, they'll pass on this tendency for up to 14 generations. Now, this can also occur in more complicated animals, including humans, things like this, passing on gene expression rather than actual changes in DNA. What is usually exaggerated here is this is usually reported as genetic memory. What is being carried forward is not a memory per se. It's a behavioral tendency. It is certainly nothing like memory. These roundworms don't remember experiencing this change in their UV reactants. You probably cannot encode episodic memories in the way that Alien Resurrection shows into your DNA and pass it on either to your offspring or to your own clone. So that's totally unlikely. Sorry, I'm trying to go fast so we have some time for discussion. Memory erasure. There are movies that talk about erasing memories, such as Men in Black. My favorite movie, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. If you've never seen it, Jim Carrey's character and Kate Winslet's character, they're dating, they break up, they both decide to have each other erased from their memories. So what happens though is as Jim Carrey's character is going through this procedure, he changes his mind. He doesn't want her erased. So he starts trying to hide her in other memories so that she isn't erased. So here he has edited one of his childhood memories to put her in it so that when he wakes up from the procedure, he can still remember her in some way. We cannot currently do this. There's no technology that will allow us to go in and erase someone's memories. You can choose to forget things. It's called directed forgetting. People can do this. You can just choose to forget things and be unable to think about them in the future. And certainly you can change memories on purpose. So some forms of therapy right now, especially for traumatic past events, do involve taking advantage of this, trying to change our current memories of past events. Similarly, well, not really similarly, at the same time, high levels of stress can interfere with the memory formation process. It can interrupt how we make memories. So when people experience, for example, being robbed at gunpoint, that is so stressful that they often don't make good memories in terms of detail. They often can't remember anything about the event except for maybe what the weapon looked like. But certainly what happens is their emotion becomes dominated when they make it. Their memory becomes dominated by emotion, not by detail. So it's not quite memory erasure, but it's certainly not forming a good memory to begin with. The idea of memory repression is certainly not, does not really occur, at least not often. People can forget traumatic memories. More often, they're hard to forget. This movie, Lavender, the main character might have killed her entire family and repressed a memory of it. That certainly is unlikely. In terms of memory implanting, if you've never seen the original Total Recall, so basically Quaid lives a boring life. He goes to this company Recall to put in some interesting memories where he goes on a trip to Mars and he's a special agent. He has sex with this beautiful woman, etc. So, it's a memory he never had, a totally created memory that literally his intent is to have this implanted so that in the future he thinks this really occurred. Memory implantation plays a minor role in the original Blade Runner. It's a big part of the story in the Blade Runner sequel, where basically you have these artificial humans, these replicants. They're only a couple of years old, but they're supposed to be normally functioning adults. So they basically have to have memories, artificial memories implanted into them so that they are somewhat normal functioning. Interestingly, both of these stories were movies were based on short stories by the same author, Philip K. Dick. We cannot currently do this with technology, but we can create completely false or altered memory by using forced confabulation, whether you're under hypnosis or not, getting people to believe that extremely weird things and unrealistic things have happened to them. A lot of this research was originated by Elizabeth Loftus. She's certainly the most famous for it. Plenty of other people do research in this field as well, but she tends to dominate most discussion of it. Over the years, she's gotten people to believe that, for example, when they were a child, they were lost in the mall and the cops had to come and all this stuff that never happened, or that when they were a kid, they were in a hot air balloon when in fact they were never on a hot air balloon ride. In one study, they were even able to get people to believe that when they were a kid, they were possessed by a demon and they had to perform an exorcism. That clearly never happened. Susan Clancy, who is also a cognitive psychology researcher, she has this great little book called Abducted, How People Come to Believe They're Kidnapped by Aliens, where she interviews a ton of people who believe they're abducted by aliens. And she realizes that, all these people never thought this until they went for therapy for things like depression. They were put under hypnosis. They were forced to confabulate about their alien abduction, which none of them claimed ahead of time to have happened. And they came out, over time, believing that they were abducted by aliens. They had these false created memories that they never actually experienced an event for. I will skip this. Long story short, if you watch Total Recall or if you watch the deleted scenes for Eternal Sunshine, there's funny commercials about not only memory insertion, but memory deletion. There's a ton of TV shows you can watch that also have to do with memory. I'll end on this quote so that we can go to discussion. So I'm sorry I did not time that well, but I want to make sure we have some time for discussion.
That's okay. I think it worked well. Thank you so much
I'm
for
sorry.
doing that. No worries. No worries.
I could talk for 3 hours if you let me.
All right, so let's see here. We did have somebody ask, and I can't quite, it was about the 12:30 mark.
Okay.
So Carol had asked, is this why Drew Barrymore's character draws paints Sandler's character's face, though she can't say why she does it?
Probably. There would probably have to be some amount of, episodic memory there to be able to remember a face. But certainly I think that's what they're getting at, is that despite, what seems like her hopeless condition, there's some underlying hope there that she can remember him, that, his efforts are slowly paying off.
She mentions conditioning.
Yeah, so you really can't be conditioned to remember a face like that. Because the memory for the face would have to be, would it have to be a new episodic memory as opposed to you make a semantic memory? I guess there's a way you can work around it so that it works not just in the movie but within reality. Yeah.
Okay. A couple more comments here. She said, Carol also goes on to say, Sheldon Cooper in The Big Bang Theory has hyperthymesia, although he calls it eidetic memory.
So eidetic memory is usually what we call photographic memory. They probably are not the same thing definitionally. So eidetic or photographic memory would be what I described. Some people on the autism spectrum seem to have something like that, where they could draw things extremely accurately, just from memory. That would be more like eidetic or photographic memory. Hyperthymesia doesn't mean you couldn't, remember images, but hyperthymesia is really focused on the episodic memory system, which is about events that you experienced. You would have to still have noticed something in the event as you're experiencing it. So I don't think that hyperthymesia allows you to later recall information that you did not pay strong attention to during the event. Certainly they recall seemingly unimportant things, but they would have had to notice them. So like, what did I wear that day? It certainly seems unimportant in the long term, but if they didn't pay attention to what they were wearing that day, they probably would not be able to remember it in the future. With eidetic memory, I'm pretty sure that, importance of information seems to be less important for people who claim to have eidetic memory. There's also some debate about whether photographic memory actually does exist, whereas hyperthymesia clearly does exist.
Okay, cool. All right, so we do have another, people did laugh at your South Park joke.
Okay, good.
Including myself, but they wanted to let you know that they were laughing.
So I see someone's clarifying. So yeah, it does seem like Sheldon probably does have hyperthymesia, and they just call it photographic memory or eidetic memory. Else. Okay, thank you I don't watch that show, so thank you for clarifying.
And then Matthew mentioned there was a guy with a virus in his brain who remembered his wife's face, but nothing else ever. And then we do have a question in our Q&A section as well.
Okay.
So Mark typed in, are there any memory phenomena you think would make for a good movie or TV show, but nobody's really done it yet?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not a TV writer, unfortunately, or a movie writer. That's a good question. I can't really think of one that I couldn't find anything for. I don't think hyperthymesia has realistically been depicted in anything. It's always this like, I'm going to use my superior memory to solve murders. I think there's you could probably make a real drama there, because a lot of people with hyperthymesia, talk about the downsides of it. So some of us, we might take it for granted that we can forget things. We might take it for granted that over time memories change. For them, they can't forget things, and their memories don't really change. So, for example, you might look back to when one of your grandparents passed away when you were a kid, and it was super sad at the time, but 20, 30 years later, it's not super sad in the same way now. Whereas people with hyperthymesia report that when they think about an old memory now, it comes back now with the same intensity that it always did. So, some of the real people with hyperthymesia have, reported a very strong downside to this condition. That interferes with their relationships, it interferes with their just general well-being. So I think maybe that could be dealt with in a more realistic and interesting way, besides just, I'm going to solve murders somehow with hyperthymesia.
That's fair. We do have another question in the Q&A. If this is from Matthew, are there exercises that we can do to improve one's innate memory abilities, not like mnemonics, but implicit abilities?
So if you see commercials or advertisements for memory training, those techniques probably don't work. A lot of those are, especially advertised towards older adults, people who either are experiencing early forms of memory loss or who just want to stave it off. Those techniques don't really seem to do much except make people better at those tasks. So they can improve your performance of those memory tasks, but they don't seem to produce a generalized memory benefit. So unfortunately, I'd say no. There are ways, mnemonics, deeper processing, deeper thinking, forming associations, practicing, actually doing retrieval practice is one of the best ways to enhance your memory for something. But I don't know if that's, in terms of, is there an easy way to do it? Probably not an easy technique or an easy solution.
A couple more in the chat here. Carol mentions, if memories change over time or cannot be recorded due to stress, does this call into question eyewitness testimony in trials?
Absolutely. So one reason that eyewitness testimony gets a bad rap is if you look at when a witness is first questioned, they might say, so their account is usually very accurate, close to when the event actually occurred. That should be when information is taken, and it should be honestly reported at the future, court trial, for example, or later in that form. What often happens is an eyewitness close to the time of event tells what they think, they saw happen. And they might be asked, how confident are you? And they might say, I'm not very confident. I think that's what I saw. Over time, though, they're repeatedly questioned. They're repeatedly made to tell this story by law enforcement, by lawyers, by doing practice runs of their testimony. Over time, that not only introduces intrusions of information. That's one thing that Elizabeth Loftus's research, and others has showed very well, that you can change people's eyewitness memory. It also changes, even if it doesn't change what they remember, it changes their confidence. So people become more and more confident as they retell these stories. If you look back at incorrect eyewitness identifications, early in time, the eyewitnesses would say, I think this is the guy, but I'm not sure. Once they pick that person, though, over time, they start to say, that's the guy, I'm sure of it. And it's not because their memory has gotten better or somehow more accurate. It's because you've changed their subjective thinking about their memory.
Okay, let's see. Matthew mentioned that it was Clive Waring who he was thinking of about the virus. Always cried and embraced his wife, saying it was the first time he saw her, but yeah, all that stuff.
I'm just not familiar with it, so I apologize. It does sound, it kind of sounds like some form of both retrograde and anterograde amnesia. I'd have to know more about exactly what memory functioning he's lost.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure either. And Elizabeth, I believe is one of your grad students, loves the show, Big Bang Theory, and
Okay.
typed in a lot here. So Carol's Big Bang Theory question, his explanation associating eidetic and autism spectrum is in line with the show canon. The Amy character is a real life neuroscientist. She consulted on the spin of that particular aspect. They are careful distinctions in the show to mark him as not having hyperthymesia.
Okay. Thank you, Elizabeth.
And Emma says Clive Waring had anterograde and retrograde memory loss.
Okay, that makes sense based on what people are describing the situation as. Sorry, I'm just not as familiar with that one. If they didn't make a movie about it, I guess I don't know. I'll have to wait for the Big Bang movie.
All right, so we do have about 16 attendees left before everybody else disappears because we are on the hour. I just want to mention, if you are interested in this series, feel free to contact me, Amanda Lobmeyer, Innocent Abbasam, Rob Weiner, or I'm missing somebody, Jessica Simpson, who is one of our other STEM librarians here. You can contact any of us. We are on the SciPop panel series team here, setting these up. We are working, we've got 2 more set between now and May. So we've got Amanda up next, and then Blaine will be talking about Foundation, Isaac Asimov, and Amanda will be talking about Thanos and Snap. So that's coming up in about 2 weeks-ish. And just, let me see, is there anything else I needed to, yeah, if you want to contact us about participating in a session, you want to run a session, please also let us know. I also want to give a big shout out to our promotion and marketing team. They're chilling on our YouTube channel, and they were keeping things running for us today. So thank you, Ryan Burns, no relation to me, but thank you to Ryan for being out there and helping us today. And thank you so much, Dr. Sarah, for joining us.
Thank you, and I apologize again for going over time.
It's all right. We do appreciate you, and it seems like everybody else is mentioning that as well. So, okay, yeah, I know we're looking at time. We all gotta go. Thank you so much. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and we'll see you next